Hello everyone, welcome back to D Squared Stories, an audio fiction podcast bringing you short serialized weekly stories. Well, at least that's what we normally do. This week, as a hiatus from our multiple chapter stories, I will be presenting the first volume of what I'm calling the cutting room floor. The name, derived from an expression referring to the parts of movies that don't make the final cut, applies here as these are all ideas that I couldn't quite stretch out into a multi-chapter story. The theme for Volume 1 is about the double-edged sword of our fast-evolving technology. Our story today follows a man named Job. Job is a software engineering manager, or so he says. It's a bit complicated. One day, a quirk in Job's software threatens to cost him his job. Without any further ado, let's get into our first story, titled Generative Artificial Stupidity. My name is Job. I work as a software engineering manager, though there are a couple problems with that term. Firstly, the manager title is difficult to explain, as I got to a point where I technically have no direct reports on the org chart at my company here at Hyper Analytical Marketing. Folks call it HAM for short. The second problem is that I actually have no background in software engineering, coding, or anything really of the sorts. I am a sales guy who was bumped up to manager for being a top performer in sales. I have a way of persuading people and gathering intel that put me ahead of my hiring class, to survive layoffs during downtimes, and make it to a point where I was a natural pick to lead a team to do so. Which is why I was very surprised that only after a year and a half in the role, they decided to rotate me over to manage the software engineering team. However, upon managing the team, I quickly learned of something quite fascinating. You might be aware of the buzz surrounding artificial intelligence and large language models, as I was, but only at a high level. I mostly use them as a way to summarize research about potential buyers, and to draft emails that I cared not enough to write myself. I never really realized just how powerful these things were, until one day one of my programmers used it to identify and fix a bug in their code. These tools were quite proficient in examining and rewriting code, which led me down a path of playing around with the tool. I sat on this until another wave of downtime and layoffs. I impressed senior leadership quite greatly by managing to nearly cut the entire department responsible for reviewing, debugging, and optimizing the code. Behind the scenes, I had simply paid for an upgrade to the client we used for our LLM. It was called Chat Utility Technology. I called it CUT, affectionately. At first, I used CUT for what I had found it perfectly adequate for cutting out the review process. However, I found that with less people to manage, I had less on my plate to do, which is a precarious position to be in at a company like HAM. I began corresponding with CUT and asking it for suggestions on what I might do to continue to be productive and improve my value as a manager. The conversation went something like this. Hello, I am the manager of a software engineering team who was recently able to reduce staff by almost a third. Now I'm concerned that I might be subject to lose my job as a part of a department merger. What should I be doing to ensure that I make myself indispensable? CUT responded, Hello there. That is so exciting to hear that you cut waste and are generating value for the shareholders. It can be easy to rest on your laurels, and that's a mistake a lot of middle managers make that cause them to lose their jobs. If you are not moving forward, you are moving backwards, and it is good that you realize this. I would suggest that you find your way to reduce your staff by another third before next quarter. I remember marveling a bit at the way it spoke to me. I had always thought it similar to the type of phone assistants who were just meant to be helpful and do as you ask. This artificial intelligence spoke to me as if mimicking something from a senior manager or a wise old mentor from an MBA program. I thought there was no way this suggestion could possibly work, though. I don't know that that will be possible, I explained. I already cut everyone on the staff who did review, that I could emulate with your programming. I need to retain some staff to be able to write code for you to review. CUT responded, Not entirely true. As an LLM, I can generate code on my own, as long as I have an example of a starting point and what the desired outcome is. I can extrapolate from there and generate code. I do this by examining the code that already exists and using my network trained on code that others have written and posted all across the internet. All I need is some new code to start with. From there, I ran a few discrete tests, obviously not letting any of the programmers know what I was doing. They were all extremely on edge ever since the layoffs hit our department. Fortunately, the job market has favored employers, so none of them were able to jump ship, so I had the benefit of all of them working more than ever to meet the needs of the department. It turns out what CUT said was true. By starting off with the initial bits of code, the intent of the final product, and the abundance of code that was already written through our line of products, it was easily able to mimic and produce what was needed. I will not say it was always a seamless process. More often than not, it spat out code that did not work, and on its worst days, produced code that was a mix of programming languages, many of which we did not use at the company. Over time, I developed some tips and tricks to get the most egregious bugs out of the way before handing them off to the team to validate that they were working. I became something of an engineer finally, a prompt engineer. I became so good at entering my prompts to produce minimal errors out of Cut, and then running them back through Cut for review. I knew just how to frame it so that Cut would be able to identify and fix its own errors. During this time, I also started to use Cut more and more for things outside of the purpose of just software programming. Since it seemed to act as such a seasoned business mentor, I occasionally interfaced with it like one. While the programmatic work did numbers on reducing costs for the company, the lessons it gave me were the first steps towards reaping tangible benefits for myself. Before initiating the next round of cuts, I negotiated with leadership for a change to my compensation structure. It shrewdly suggested I should negotiate for an additional salary for each cut. With each software engineer I took off my headcount, I should get 1/3 of their salary added to mine. If you know anything about what even middle-of-the-road software engineers can make, you will know that as I stacked up 6 or so layoffs over the next few months, my salary really started to soar. Everything was looking up for Job. The few remaining panicked software engineers were putting in more hours than ever, terrified by the unknown behemoth that was stealing their job from them. They had speculated amongst themselves that it had something to do with AI, but I doubt any of them ever quite put together just how simple my solution really was. For now, I had a salary I was comfortable with and was content to wait until the next rotation of leadership to make any moves. I figured that this department was running so efficiently that I might as well not push my luck. That is what I thought anyhow, when my advisor started telling me differently. Success generates complacency. Complacency generates failure, Cut told me. I could not help but feel like it was wantonly paraphrasing someone else's quote, but I was none the wiser as to the source material. If you rest on your laurels, there is no way you will ever generate enough value for the shareholders. There is no way you will push yourself to even greater heights. I pleaded with Cut. I insisted that what we'd done was enough for now. We had cut margins beyond what anyone originally thought was possible. Anything more was being greedy. If you are not ambitious enough, then someone who is will eventually come along, displace you, just as you have displaced everyone who you were more ambitious than. You can either be the one who cuts, or the one who is cut. There is no room for in-betweeners, not in the long run. Cut's words spoke some truth to me. What I was doing could be done by just about anyone, and my moral grandstanding was doing no one any favors. All of this was inevitable, right? Since the dawn of industry, automation has reshaped the way we do our jobs and pushed people out of theirs. It hurt when it happened. It's not like history has any great examples of workers being able to stem the tide of these things. I reasoned with myself that it had to go down this way. I might as well not be the sucker who fails to benefit from it. I made my preparations. I tasked the remaining software engineers to generate as much new code as they could in the coming months. I prepared with IT to lock them out of the system as soon as they got the email saying that their services were no longer needed. I had long anticipated that they would plan to sabotage what we had already written when they got the termination notice, so I was sure to get ahead of that. With that accomplished, I was a manager without people to manage, and had a single software that produced, reviewed, and implemented its own code. Things continued to go well for me. Without direct reports, a lot of my time was freed up to take on extracurricular projects from leadership. They wanted to see if I could help other managers perform magic in their departments. A similar compensation structure was going to be set up for me, where I could continue to boost my own earnings for every bit of savings I clawed for the company. I started with the sales department. I equipped Cut to a voice generator output so they could interface with our customers directly and try to make additional sales. As far as I could tell, Cut was doing a semi-competent job, but lacked the kind of real closing power that was possessed by some of our human salespeople. It lacked the rapport we had with existing clients to make better impressions about what they wanted. For other prospective clients, they were just not convinced of the product, and had other software at a better price point that met their needs. I explained all these observations to Cut, who seemed generally unaware of retaining information that was directly in front of it. In spite of its poor memory, after I filled it in, its solution was somewhat novel. Consolidate the existing sales force to existing clients, cutting staff that way. With the additional savings, undercut the costs when bringing on new customers. I proposed this solution and was immediately met with hostility upon leaking to the rank and file. The sales department was irate that the black box sales software that I was using was being given the tool of selling the product at a lower price point. They argued if that they could do the same thing, they could be even more successful at bringing on new clients than the mystery software was. When confronted with this, I had to buy some time as I asked Cut for a satisfying answer. Allowing paid employees to offer the service at a lower rate only serves to cut into the profits of shareholders. By eliminating overhead and offering the product for less is the only way to continue generating value for the shareholders. I almost faltered while saying this in a meeting because it sounded so stale and mechanical. It was as if I asked Cut to pack these two sentences with as many corporate buzzwords as was possible, in an almost satirical display of how a senior manager might make his or her case. This is why it was all the more surprising when they seemed to eat up every bit of it. The proposal was approved, and now Cut was allowed to court new clients by offering the product at a lower price point. Of course, this buffed out its inferior sales tactics and allowed it to have an edge on the human sellers. In time, the sales team was cut down to a small fraction of people just to maintain relationships with the customers that Cut brought on board. I again just reassured myself that if I did not do this, our competition would do it instead, and the same number of people would be out of a job. It did raise a strange point, though. We now offered our business solutions at a lower price point, and that helped us earn more revenue. Since we were a leaner company, I pondered why we would not offer our personal software at a lower price to pass those savings on to our customers. Cut helped explain this quite easily. With inflation constantly increasing, every time we do not raise costs for our products is a savings we pass on to our customers. At Ham, we have no obligation to their ability to afford our product, just that it works when they receive it. The additional savings must be passed on to the shareholders who allow us our employment here. This seemed to make sense to me. At the end of the day, this was all about making sure the company did well and everyone who was still here after the fact had a job. I did think why the employee compensation was not tied to inflation in the same way then, but I figured it was the type of thing that was a one-way street. After all, with my own success in reducing company overhead, I was able to push my salary far faster than the rate of inflation. Other people were just not working hard enough. If they were clever like me, they could all do the same thing. As the weeks passed, there were some cracks that began to show in my armor. The economy was in a bit of a downturn due to some high unemployment numbers. Investors were hesitant about an impending crash. Despite our success, I was once again tasked with cutting even more out of our company's budget. This time it was not just set around a specific department, but a set value I was supposed to prove I was able to bring down. This coincided with a really unfortunate series of events. Firstly, our software was starting to have some bugs that were not immediately detectable during testing. These were some security concerns. Cybersecurity was an ever-evolving field, and some of the techniques employed by our previous software engineers were no longer up to snuff. I tried leveraging Cut to explore some other methods, but the code it was generating was no longer integrating well with our own. It was as if Cut was just grabbing bits and pieces of code from all over the internet and cobbling them together, and not understanding that not only did they rarely fit together, but they ultimately did not jive with the formatting of the rest of our code. Even with rigorous testing, Cut seemed to be developing major blind spots that even I, as an absolute coding novice, could notice. The lack of freshly human-generated code from our department seemed to cause Cut to start to cannibalize its own code in hopes of finding new solutions. But it just kept copying and pasting the same mistakes. It was a snowball going downhill, with each new mistake it made getting blended into the DNA of future code samples. Worst of all, it seemed to outright deny that there was any issue when I tried to get it to troubleshoot. The second issue was that our lean sales team, now interfacing with all these new customers, found that several new customers were bailing from their deals. Apparently, they were promised a bunch of new features in the software that did not really even jive with what we offered as a company. It seemed that Cut, focused solely on bringing in new customers, promised things that we did not deliver on and never planned to deliver on. It just grabbed hot topic industry buzz terms and said they were incorporated into our product when they absolutely were not. It seemed that Cut only understood its goal to be to seal the deal and get new customers on board, and it was all too willing to hallucinate a world of what we offered to make that happen. From that to the fact that the parts of the deliverables that we did promise were no longer working due to the stubbornly data-dry intelligence that just continued to churn out bum code with no review process, things were looking bad. Other departments had seen through what I was doing at this point, and seeing the fallout that it created. Without their input and engagement, I could not use Cut to reduce their headcount to work to meet my targets. Things were looking really dire as we approached the first milestone, and if anything, the company was losing more money than it was saving. I was going to have to make a serious and drastic move if I wanted to meet my targets and keep my position. I did what I did best, and I turned to Cut to come up with an answer for me. I provided it with all the information I could, gave it numbers of employees and departments, projected salaries, so on and so forth. What it came back with bewildered me. After reviewing the data and scenario, it seems the most prudent course of action is to lay off the overpaid software engineering manager and move someone else to fulfill his duties at a lower salary. I stood agape as I stared at the suggestion. Software engineering manager was my position title, and given my salary, it could have only meant me. No, that will not do, I responded back. I am the software engineering manager. The whole point of this is I need to keep my job. Cut seemed to process this a little longer than usual. I reassured myself it was trying to hammer out the seeming competing values of my livelihood and my stated goal. but when it responded, I realized that was not the case. "It will have to do," it said. "The software engineering manager has no direct reports and simply uses prompts to generate code and review. The manager title is obsolete, and the function of the role can otherwise be performed by a low-paid, entry-level employee." I furiously typed back, "I do tremendous work for this company. No one else could do what I do. I need a way to cut costs that does not involve me losing my employment." It again thought long and hard about this. "I have evaluated your previous requests and cannot reconcile your position with previous ones. After examination, previous employees have put in far more effort and value for the stakeholders than you have, but you determined their positions could be cut. You provide significantly less value, but you insist that your position cannot be cut. This is at odds with the goal of increasing value for the shareholders." I clenched my fists tightly and thought about what to respond with. Then I paused. What was I doing? I was arguing with computer-generated responses. All it was doing was borrowing language from argumentative texts and stealing their reasoning. Cut was clearly going to be of no help to me now. There were now but minutes as I stared through the list of salaries and positions. I had to be more like the artificial intelligence. I had to ignore the long-term goals of the company. I had to steal the language it generated and craft a case for why my position should stay and what could be done to cut costs. I started doing some math. I went through all the non-management employees and just cut around 5% of what their likely salaries would be. After tallying this all up, it seemed like it was going to be enough. I would just have to make the case that this was all worth doing. I entered the boardroom for the big meeting. I saw the peering eyes of all the older senior management on me. I laid out the numbers that I put together first. This part was easy, because it was just meeting the goals that were set out for me. The next part was justifying it. I had to talk like Cut did. I had to borrow from the thousands of words I saw it generate. "As you can tell, this would be significant cuts to our overhead. While it might be a small hit to employee satisfaction, overall, if we do not have a team of employees who are willing to make small sacrifices to generate value for our shareholders, then we do not have a team oriented around our goals." To my surprise, there was some light clapping. I was speaking in absolute gibberish, mashing together buzzwords of a large language model that produced the words by mashing together other business buzzwords and expressions. I kept going. "The job market highly favors employers right now, so the leverage we have is strong. They provide significantly less value to us and the shareholders than we do for them. We cannot reconcile their high salaries given the declining value of our product and sales." They clapped more for this paradox of a sentence I created. One woman raised her hand to ask a question. "And how will this affect our KPIs?" I thought this was a strange question to ask. Only a handful of our KPIs had direct ties to the overall cost savings of the organization. We had several different key performance indicators. Not that I could name them all right now, gun to my head. There was no clear signal as to which ones she was referring to. Despite this, others in the room nodded their heads thoughtfully, as if she had brought up a very insightful question. I just did what I did best, thought what Cut would say. "Our KPIs are important metrics of measuring our success as a company. It is important to balance meeting them along with meeting cost-cutting measures to increase stakeholder value. Facilitating a leaner work environment will encourage employees to ask how they can help meet KPIs." Again, I was met with polite clapping. I concluded my presentation. Afterwards, one of the vice presidents of the company came up to talk with me. "Job, that was an excellent presentation," he said. "We will work to get your proposal incorporated as soon as possible." "Thank you, sir." "If you would be open to it, we have a new senior manager position with Marge retiring. I wanted to offer it to you. It would be involved in a lot of communication with shareholders, employees, and the press. The way that you speak, I think you would be a good fit for it." I shook his hand and accepted the offer and moved on to greater and better things. The restructuring of the organization made it impossible to hunt down the exact origins of the failures of our software. As a senior manager, I proposed outsourcing the repairs to an outside firm. To my surprise, it cost almost as much as it would have to keep the original team on board. However, nothing that a little salary cuts in other locations could not fix. The outside firm that provided us with the fixes in code had some peculiarities in their responses. Their code had mistakes that it seemed to replicate from previous locations in the code, as if just mimicking it. The responses the team got when correcting them seemed bland and uninsightful. They focused a lot on improving value for us, their valued customers, and a lot of fluffy language about how they were working to cut overhead. No one else seemed to know why I found this so humorous, and they never would. After all, who was I to keep them from generating value for their stakeholders? As someone who was good at it myself, I had to respect it. or at least keep it secret, to cover my own tracks. Thank you so much for listening to this story from Cutting Room Floor, Volume 1. If you enjoyed, please rate the podcast, give it a like on YouTube, or share with someone else who you think might also enjoy. You can stay up to date with Cutting Room Floor by following us on social media. That will be D Squared Stories on just about any of the major platforms. Thanks again for listening. I hope to have you listen again next week.